The ink on the decree was dry before the first hull buckled. Not a metaphor, not a poet's flourish. In the gilded sanctum, the physical decree, stamped in pressed iridium foil, sealed with the Concorde's resonant heat mark, had been signed, rolled, and locked into the record pillar before a single human ship had received the signal. High adjudicator Mixos had timed it that way deliberately. The sanctum was built to humble. 80 tiers of crystalline seating curved inward like a closing fist. The acoustics turned a whisper into an announcement and turned silence into something you could feel against your sternum. Light came from nowhere visible, diffused through the marble-pale walls themselves, cold and even, casting no shadows. It made everything look equally small. Warden Anya Corvo stood at the central floor. She had been standing there for 6 minutes. She had not moved. Mixos descended the speaking platform at a slow, deliberate pace, his ceremonial robes spreading behind him like a tide going out. His crystalline dermal plating caught the ambient light and scattered it in cold, colorless sparks. He spoke in overlapping harmonics, two frequencies at once, that made every syllable feel like it had already been decided before he opened his mouth. The Aurelian Concord has reviewed the status of humanity's transit agreements, he said. We find them non-compliant in productivity margin, in demographic contribution, and in strategic cooperation. Corvo said nothing. Effective immediately, Mixos continued. Earth's transit rights within the outer sectors are revoked. The Shroud Nebula mining zones are reclassified as sovereign Aurelian territory. All human personnel currently operating within those zones will be subject to the Concorde's relocation protocols at the Concorde's discretion. The hall was quiet. 80 species watched from 80 tiers. Corvo reached into the case at her feet. She placed an object on the central podium, a rusted iron core weight, heavy enough that it landed with a sound like a muffled bell. The kind of tool early prospectors used to test gravity shears before the instruments were good enough to trust. The kind of thing you drop when you want to know if the floor will hold. It drops fast when the floor gives out. She stepped back. She did not speak. She did not argue or gesture or look at Mixos again. She tapped her thumb against her index finger, once, twice, 3 times, slow and even, like a countdown no one else could hear. Then she walked out. The part that stays with me still. She never asked for a reprieve. Stay with this one, you'll want to know why. 11 days earlier, the sanctum had been warm. Not physically. The gilded sanctum was never physically warm, its climate regulated to the median comfort range of the Concorde's dominant species, but politically warm, in the way a room feels when everyone in it is certain of the outcome. Mixos had arrived early. He rarely did. His aide had confirmed the votes 3 times in the preceding week. 80 species, voting strictly by economic output, and humanity's output, relative to the Concorde's top 12 contributors, was negligible. Corvo had arrived late. She had been in the outer sectors the week before, running a standard audit of the Shroud Nebula extraction zones. The jump had taken longer than expected. She walked in with a thin jacket, still faintly dusted with the mineral residue that clung to everything near the gravity shears, a pale grey particulate that smelled faintly of cold iron and recycled coolant. She had not changed. She set the case down on the table beside her seat. She poured a half cup of water from the carafe and did not drink it. Mixos watched her from the upper tier. He had reviewed humanity's file the night before. It was not a long file. A utility species, competent, durable, capable of working in high-gravity environments that most Concorde species found medically inadvisable. Useful for maintaining the hazardous infrastructure in the outer sectors. Permitted to exist within Concorde space on the basis of that usefulness. Not a threat, not an ally. A maintenance crew with a seat at the table that had always been a courtesy, not a right. The vote was a procedural matter, clean, documented, defensible. He had expected a protest. He had prepared for one, a counter-argument citing existing agreements, a formal request for delay, a diplomatic appeal to the species that traded most directly with Earth. He had a response ready for each scenario. His aide had modeled 11 possible human reactions. They had not modeled silence. The vote passed in 42 minutes, 80 species voting strictly by economic output. The margin was not close. Mixos announced the result in his standard resonant double tone, watching Corvo's face as he did. She was looking at a point on the far wall. Her breathing did not change. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, steady, not gripping. Then she reached for the case. He had assumed it contained documentation, counterfilings, a formal objection, a request for arbitration. The Concord had a standard process for those. He had a team ready to receive the filings and route them into the appropriate review queue, which had a standard processing time of 6 to 14 months. She took out the iron weight instead. It was old. The surface had the deep, mottled rust of something that had been in the field for decades, the kind of tool you found on early prospectors' belts in the outer sectors before the precision instruments were reliable enough to trust. The Shroud Nebula was full of them, or had been. She set it on the podium. The sound was low and solid. She tapped her thumb against her index finger 3 times. She left. No filings were submitted. No counter-argument was entered into the record. No diplomatic channels opened in the hours that followed. No human representative answered a single Concord communication in the 48 hours after the vote. The silence was total. Mixos reviewed the communications log himself at the 30-hour mark. He had assumed a delay, grief, perhaps, or internal political reorganization. Humans processed institutional shocks slowly. He had seen it before. A species needed time to absorb a reversal of status before it could mount a coherent response. At 48 hours, the silence was still total. His aide flagged it. No acknowledgement of the decree. No routing of their personnel through relocation channels. No contact from any registered human diplomatic office. "They're processing," Mixo said. "The prospectors in the Shroud are outside Concord relocation jurisdiction. The decree transferred administrative control, but our relocation teams cannot access the zones without transit clearance. The clearance has to be issued by Earth," Mixo said. "Yes." "Which has not responded." He was not concerned. Earth would respond. They always did. The procedural reality of the situation would force their hand. The prospectors in the Shroud needed resupply. Resupply required transit. Transit now required Concord authorization. Authorization required contact. Contact required acknowledgement of the decree. The steps were logical, sequential, and unavoidable. He had, if he was precise about it, built a system that would force them to the table. On the third day, the navigational beacons in the outer sectors, the ones that marked the safe corridors through the high-mass zones near the Shroud, went dark. Not all at once. In sequence. One, then the next, like lights being switched off in a long hallway. His aide brought him the telemetry. Equipment failure. "Probably," Mixo said. He filed a maintenance request. Maintenance requests in the outer sectors had a standard processing time because the maintenance crews in the outer sectors had been human. He did not connect those two facts immediately. On the 5th day, the first casualty reports arrived. The Shroud Nebula's ambient mass shear, the gravitational pressure differential that made the zone both enormously rich in heavy minerals and lethally hostile to unshielded navigation, had increased measurably. The mass anchor arrays that had been holding the shear within survivable limits were reading anomalous. Low output. Intermittent signal. 8,300 human prospectors were in the Shroud. The casualty reports were not Concord reports. They came from the prospectors themselves, short-range emergency transmissions directed at frequencies that had once been monitored by human relay stations. The relay stations did not answer. The transmissions were intercepted by a Concord border post as signal bleed. Mixos read the first one. He set it down. He read the maintenance request he had filed on day 3 and saw, for the first time, that it had been automatically routed to a department whose entire staffing roster was composed of human contractors. none of whom had responded to anything in 72 hours. He looked at the telemetry from the Masanka arrays again. Low output, intermittent signal. Not failing. Going offline in sequence. He called for a full sector diagnostic. The results came back in 40 minutes. The diagnostic showed 17 anchor stations in the Shroud Nebulas in a gradient zone reading as powered down. Not damaged, not malfunctioning. Powered down deliberately. Get me an Aurelian engineering team in the sector, Mixo said. His voice was still level. He had not yet changed the category of the problem in his mind. It was still a logistics problem, a maintenance problem, a coordination failure. His aide said, "Sir, we don't have Aurelian-certified personnel who are rated for work in that gravity gradient. The Shroud requires, it has always required." "Human crews," Mixo said. The aide did not answer. Mixo sat with that for a moment. The silence in the office felt different from the silence in the sanctum. The sanctum's silence was designed, a product of acoustics, of architecture, of ceremony. This silence was just the absence of an answer he had not thought to need. He pulled the file on the Shroud Nebula's infrastructure. It was a long file. He had never read it before. The Masanka arrays had been installed over 40 years of continuous human engineering work. The anchor density required for safe transit through the inner gradient was the result of 11 separate expansion projects. The system's maintenance logs read as a continuous, unbroken record of human labor, calibrations, replacements, expansions, responses to gravity event spikes, hundreds of thousands of individual service entries. The infrastructure was not a feature of the Shroud Nebula. It was something humans had built inside it, piece by piece, and held together by continuous, skilled, dangerous work. He pulled up the current anchor status. 17 offline in the inner gradient, 6 more in the middle band showing declining output. He counted the days since the vote. 5. He reached for his communication terminal. Warden Anya Corvo's channel returned a single automated message. No diplomatic language, no acknowledgement of his rank or his office. This channel is no longer monitored. Please direct all inquiries to the Aurelian Concord's administrative body, as per decree issued 11 days prior. The date on the message was the same date she had walked out of the sanctum. She had set the auto-reply before she left the building. He stared at the screen for a long time. Behind him, through the wide observation panel of his office on the Vanguard, the outer sector was still and dark. The navigational beacons that had once made it readable, that had once turned the high-mass void into a network of safe corridors, were gone. What remained was a field of dense, unmarked space, lit only by the cold, slow luminescence of the nebula itself. No roads, no markers, no guides. Just the shroud and its weight. Mixos ordered a full status review of every human-operated system in the Concorde's outer sector infrastructure. The results came back across 3 hours, department by department, in the kind of language that sounded calm until you read it carefully. Human relay stations, offline. Transition logged as scheduled maintenance pending reassignment. Human calibration teams assigned to the Masanka grid, absent. Last logged location in the Shroud Nebula in a zone 11 days prior. No exit records. Human courier routes through the high-mass corridor network, suspended. No replacement routing filed. Human waste processing crews on 4 Concorde border stations, absent. Stations operating on emergency automated cycles rated for 72 hours. He set the review down. He looked at it again, as though a second reading would reclassify what he was seeing. It did not. Across every department that had logged any human contractor involvement in the past 18 months, the word absent, repeated without variation, without explanation, without forwarding contact. They had not quit. Quitting required a filing. They had simply stopped appearing. He called the Aurelian Fleet Command and ordered a preliminary positioning of the Vanguard and her escort group toward the Shroud Nebula sector, a precautionary presence, a show of administrative control over the newly reclassified territory. It was a reasonable, proportionate response. The Concorde had done it dozens of times when a territorial transfer required physical confirmation. Fleet Command confirmed. Transit time to the Shroud boundary, 4 days. Mixos returned to his office and pulled the casualty transmissions from the Concorde border post's intercept log. He read them in order. They were short. Emergency frequency transmissions were always short, compressed for range, and they were dated across the 5 days since the vote. The first ones were logistical, supply requests, requests for relay confirmation, requests for routing instructions, for guidance, for any signal from the human stations that had gone dark. The later ones were different. One transmission from a prospector named Daria Vasek, operating a single crew extraction rig in the inner gradient, lasted 11 seconds. She gave her rig's designation number, her position coordinates, and a reading from her hull stress monitor. Then she said, "The anchors are gone. I don't understand the anchors are gone." The transmission ended there. Mixos set the log down. 8,300 people. He had read the number in his aide's briefing and filed it the way you file a large number, as a scale indicator, not as a count of anything particular. Now he read Daria Vasek's 11-second transmission, and the number changed shape in his mind. It was not a demographic figure anymore. It was a roster. 8,300 individual people, each in a rig, each sending transmissions that were going nowhere, each watching their hull stress monitors climb past thresholds designed to signal danger and into ranges that had no designed signal because no instrument designer had thought to plan for this. He set a relocation order, emergency classification. The Aurelian fleet, on its way to the Shroud for administrative positioning, would now also carry relocation authority for the human personnel currently in the zone. His aide brought him the response from the fleet's logistics division within the hour. The relocation authority was noted. The logistics division's assessment was brief. To extract personnel from the inner gradient of the Shroud Nebula, the fleet would need navigational guidance through the high-mass zones. The navigational beacons were offline. Replacement beacon arrays could be deployed, but deployment required transit through the same corridors the beacons were meant to mark. The fleet would need the beacons to get to where the beacons needed to be installed. The aide did not say anything after delivering this assessment. He did not need to. The circularity was self-evident. Mixos approved the fleet's transit anyway. His navigators were experienced. The high-mass corridors were dangerous without beacons, not impossible. The Vanguard had deep scan array capability. They would proceed carefully and they would reach the Shroud. And when they reached it, they would find whatever remained of the human anchor infrastructure and they would assess from there. It was manageable. On the 8th day, a Concorde science vessel, running a routine mineral survey on the outer edge of the Shroud, filed an anomalous gravity event report. The ambient mass shear in the inner gradient had increased by a measurable margin. Not dramatically, not catastrophically. A margin consistent with the gradual decay of anchor array output over time. The science vessel's lead analyst wrote in the report's notes field, "If this rate of increase continues linearly, the inner gradient will exceed rated tolerance for standard heavy hull vessels within approximately 3 weeks. If the rate is not linear, if anchor output is dropping faster than our current readings suggest, the timeline shortens considerably." The report was filed to the Concorde's infrastructure division, cross-listed to Fleet Command, and automatically forwarded to the human maintenance contractor who had managed the Shroud anchor grid for the past 9 years. The forwarding system did not flag an error. It had no way to know that the address it forwarded to had been set 11 days prior to return a single automated message. The report sat, acknowledged by no one, in a queue that was not being monitored. Mixos did not see it for 2 days. The Vanguard crossed into the outer Shroud boundary on the 10th day after the vote. 9,000 warships, The full administrative enforcement group, plus the relocation support vessels his aide had scrambled, moved in formation through the outer zone. The deep scan arrays were running. The navigators were careful. The outer zone was passable. The mass shear there was elevated, but within the fleet's operational tolerance. The absence of navigational beacons was an inconvenience, not an obstacle. The deep scan arrays painted the corridor with enough resolution to navigate safely, if slowly. Mixos watched from the Vanguard's bridge as the formation moved inward. He had been watching the shroud's external appearance for years, the slow, cold luminescence of compressed gas and heavy particulate, lit from within by the gravitational stress of its own mass. It was beautiful in the way that things that could kill you were often beautiful, impersonal, enormous, indifferent. He had never been inside it before. That was not unusual. The Concorde's senior officials rarely visited the outer sectors personally. That was what the human crews were for. The deep scan arrays updated every 30 seconds. The inner gradient readings scrolled across the bridge display, mass shear levels by zone, corridor integrity ratings, anchor ray output signals. On the 12th pass of the display, Mixos noticed something. The anchor ray output column, which should have shown partial output from the remaining operational stations, even with 17 offline, was reading 0 across every entry. Not low, not intermittent, 0. His chief navigator was already looking at the same display. She was a senior officer, decorated, 22 years in fleet command. She looked at the readout for 4 seconds without speaking. "Sir," she said, "the anchor stations aren't damaged." "I can see that. If they were damaged, we'd see residual output, decay signatures, something." She highlighted 3 entries on the display, pulling their diagnostic breakdowns onto a separate screen. These stations are reading as fully intact, power cells at rated capacity, housing structures undamaged, internal mechanisms in calibration range. Then why are they offline? "They're not offline," she said. "They've been disconnected. From the inside. Someone physically uncoupled the output relays and locked the manual overrides." Mixos looked at the display. The anchor stations were not broken. They were turned off. Carefully, deliberately, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and how to do it so that the stations could not be remotely restarted. You would need to be inside, each one to reconnect them. Inside, in the inner gradient, where the mass shear was climbing. He turned to the communications officer. "Get me a channel to Warden Corvo." The communications officer opened the channel. The response was immediate. The same automated message that had been waiting since the morning of the vote. "This channel is no longer monitored. Please direct all inquiries to the Aurelian Concorde's administrative body, as per decree issued 11 days prior." The bridge was quiet. The deep scan display updated. The inner gradient mass shear readings had climbed 3 points since the last pass. The navigation computer flagged the change with a yellow indicator. Not an alarm, not yet, just a note that conditions were shifting. Mixos looked at the flag. He looked at the 0 output column. He looked at the readout for the relocation vessels positioned at the fleet's rear, the ships that carried the extraction teams meant to retrieve the human prospectors. The relocation teams could not reach the inner gradient. The inner gradient, without anchors holding the shear in check, was beyond their hull ratings. The prospectors were in the inner gradient. He understood, for the first time, the full shape of what had happened. Not all of it, not yet, but enough of the shape to know that the relocation order he had filed on day 5 was a document that would never be executed, that the fleet he had sent to administer a territorial transfer was sitting inside a space that was quietly, mathematically, becoming something else. No warning, no threat, no declaration. Just the shroud, adjusting to the absence of the things that had been holding it back. On the bridge of the Vanguard, a junior sensor technician ran a standard equipment check on the formation's perimeter sensors. He recalibrated the deep scan array's outer ring. logged the calibration in the ship's maintenance record, and noted in the remarks field that 3 of the perimeter sensors were reading anomalous mass distribution patterns at the formation's rear edge, patterns inconsistent with the nebula's established density profile. He flagged the anomaly as low priority, possible sensor drift. He moved on to the next item on his checklist. The patterns were not sensor drift. The anomalous readings had a source. The Vanguard's deep scan array found it on the next pass, 40 distinct mass signatures, holding position at the extreme outer edge of the inner gradient, not moving, not broadcasting, not running any active system that would show on standard detection sweeps. They were cold and still and shaped like nothing the array's pattern recognition library had ever been asked to identify, because the library had been built on Aurelian hull geometries, and these were not Aurelian. The chief navigator pulled the signatures onto the main display. She enlarged the clearest one. It was angular, low profile, built close to the hull, the kind of design you made when you wanted to minimize the surface area the gravity shear could grab. Heavy plating on the forward face. Engine housing recessed deep into the body. No external weapons mounting visible. "What are they?" Mixos asked. "I don't know," she said. "The profile doesn't match anything in the registry." "Whose registry?" She turned to look at him. "The Concord's." The display updated. The 40 signatures had not moved. They were not moving now. They were simply there, positioned at the edge of the zone where the mass shear was climbing, sitting in the geometry of the gravity, well the way a door sits in a frame. Mixos opened a channel to the formation's lead security officer. "I want an identification protocol run on those contacts, all 40. The security officer ran the protocol. It took 6 minutes. The result came back in a single line. No match found in Concorde vessel registry. Recommend visual confirmation. Visual confirmation required closing distance. Mixos authorized it. He sent 2 fast scout vessels toward the nearest signature, a precautionary approach, weapons cold, running standard hail frequencies. The hail went unanswered. The scouts closed to visual range. They transmitted their feed to the Vanguard's bridge. The image that came back showed a vessel that was almost invisible against the nebula's background, matte-surfaced, non-reflective, its geometry breaking up its outline so that the eye slid off it rather than landing on it. The scout's lights caught the forward face at an angle, and for a moment the hull material was visible. Heavy, rough-textured, the deep grey-brown of iron-rich alloy that had been worked and reworked until it was dense beyond what standard hull plating required. It looked like something built for a place where the physics wanted to kill you. One of the Scout's pilots transmitted a voice message to the Vanguard. "Sir, I've seen this material before, in survey reports from the shroud in a zone." A pause. It's prospector-grade hull cladding, military spec, but the base material is the same thing they use on the extraction rigs. The silence that followed on the Vanguard's bridge lasted 4 seconds. Then the 40 contacts lit up simultaneously. Not weapons systems, not engines, not any system the Vanguard's threat assessment array recognized as a standard activation signature. What lit up was a field emitter on each vessel's outer hull, a localized gravity compensation array oriented inward toward the formation. Not at the formation, around it. "They're shielding us," the navigator said, and her voice had gone flat with the effort of saying it neutrally. "Those arrays are projecting a gravity compensation field around our perimeter." "Why would they?" "Because the shear is about to exceed our hull tolerance," she said, "and they knew that before we did." Mixos looked at the ambient mass shear readings on the main display. They had climbed while the identification protocol was running, while the scouts were closing distance, while he was looking at hull cladding and not at the numbers. The inner gradient shear level had passed the fleet's rated operational tolerance 6 minutes ago. The fleet was already inside the threshold. The compensation arrays on the 40 contacts were not a gesture. They were the only reason the formation's outer hulls had not yet begun to register stress fractures. "No warning," No negotiation, no declaration. They had simply been there, holding the physics back, waiting. Mixos called for a full formation halt. The fleet stopped moving inward. He ordered a structural assessment of every hull in the formation, outer ring first, then mid-formation, then the core group around the vanguard. The results came back in the order he had requested them. The outer ring showed stress readings above baseline on 31 vessels. Not critical, not yet, but climbing. Mid-formation was clean. The 40 contacts compensation arrays had enough range to hold the mid and inner formation stable. The outer ring was at the edge of their coverage. They could extend the coverage to the outer ring, the navigator said. She was reading the same telemetry he was. Those arrays have the output for it. They're running at about 40% capacity right now. Then why aren't they? She said nothing. Because they chose not to. Because the outer ring was the edge of what they were willing to hold, and everything inside that edge was a decision, not a limitation. The 40 contacts were not malfunctioning. They were not running at partial capacity because of a technical constraint. They were running at partial capacity because someone had decided exactly how much of the Aurelian formation to protect and had calculated it in advance, and the outer ring fell outside that calculation. Mixos understood then that this was not a defensive position. It was a demonstration. He tried to raise the contacts on every frequency the Vanguard's communication array carried. Standard hail, emergency frequency, diplomatic channel, broad-spectrum broadcast. He used his full title and the full name of the Aurelian Concord. Nothing. He ordered the formation to reverse course, to pull back toward the outer zone, where the shear was lower, where the hull stress on the outer ring would ease. His fleet admiral confirmed the order and issued the retreat signal to the formation. 42 seconds later, the admiral came back. "Sir, the rear formation engines are not responding." "Which vessels?" "All of them. Rear formation, mid-formation, outer ring." A pause. "Sir, I'm getting the same report from the core group. The engines are not responding." Mixos turned to the Vanguard's chief engineer. The chief engineer was already at her station, running diagnostics. She ran them twice. She looked up. "The propulsion arrays are intact," she said. "Hardware is undamaged. Power is flowing. But the exhaust manifolds are." She stopped. She ran the diagnostic a third time. "The exhaust manifolds are sealed. Something hit them, something small, very fast, very precise. The manifolds are sealed shut, and the backup bypass is also sealed." "When?" "The impact signatures are from," she checked the timestamp, "about 40 minutes ago, while we were running the identification protocol." Mixos was very still. 40 minutes ago, the fleet had been occupied with the identification protocol, with the scouts closing distance, with the hull cladding observation, with the hail frequencies, with the assessment authorization. 40 minutes of focused attention on the contact's identity, and while that attention was forward-facing, something had come from a different direction entirely, small, fast, precise, and had sealed every propulsion manifold in a 9,000-ship formation without triggering a single weapons alert. Because they had not come from the contact's direction, the 40 visible contacts were not the weapon. He looked at the deep scan array. He widened the sweep radius. On the third pass, the array caught what it had missed before: faint kinetic trails, already dissipating in the nebula's particulate. Narrow, calibrated, originating from positions outside the sweep's original range, beyond the 40 visible contacts, at angles that had threaded between the formation's own vessels, without striking anything except the specific components they were aimed at. Someone had mapped the formation's exhaust manifold positions before the fleet entered the shroud. Mixos looked at the fleet's entry record. He looked at the date. They had filed their entry route 4 days ago. Standard administrative procedure. The route had been logged to the Concord's Infrastructure Division for safety coordination. Standard practice for any fleet movement through a hazardous sector. The Infrastructure Division's Outer Sector Coordination Desk had been staffed, until 11 days ago by human contractors. He sat down. He did this without meaning to. His legs simply carried him to his chair and deposited him there, and he became aware of sitting only after it had happened. No warning, no threat, no declaration. He had been told the entry route would be coordinated for safety. It had been, just not his safety. The hull stress alert on the outer ring moved from yellow to amber at the same moment. 31 vessels, stress readings climbing. The compensation arrays on the 40 contacts had not extended their coverage. They were not going to extend their coverage. Mike Sows looked at the amber indicators and understood the full arithmetic of his position for the first time. 9,000 ships, no propulsion, in a gravity well with no anchors and a shear level that was climbing toward a number that had no upper limit. The compensation arrays on 40 small vessels that had been waiting here, positioned here, before the fleet had even crossed the boundary, were the only thing between his formation and the raw, indifferent physics of the shroud. And those arrays were running at 40% capacity. He had sent this fleet to administer a territorial transfer. He had not sent it to fight. He had not sent it to fight because there had been nothing to fight. No human fleet, no visible force, no military posture. He had, if he was precise about it, sent 9,000 ships into a space that a smaller civilization had spent 40 years learning to control, staffed by crews who did not know the shroud the way the people who had built it knew it, with no beacons and no anchors and no maintenance crews and no one who would answer a hail. He was not in a battle. He was in a room whose walls were slowly closing, and the only people who knew how to stop the walls had left the building and locked the door behind them. His communications officer spoke quietly. "Sir, one of the contacts is broadcasting." Mike Sows looked up. Audio only, no visual, no identification header. The communications officer's hands were steady on his console. "Do you want me to put it through?" The 40 contacts had not answered a single hail. They had not transmitted on any frequency. They had been silent for every minute of the fleet's presence in the shroud, and now one of them was choosing to speak. "Put it through," Mixo said. The channel opened. There was a sound first, brief, low, the kind of ambient background noise a channel carries when it is open and the speaker is in a working environment. Then a voice, calm, no particular urgency. A woman's voice, the tone of someone reading from a document they have already reviewed. "You have approximately 90 minutes before the outering stress ratings exceed structural tolerance. The compensation arrays will maintain current coverage for that duration. Your escape pods are rated for the shear levels in the outer zone. The arrays will extend localized coverage to each pod as it ejects, individually, for 12 minutes per pod. That is enough time to clear the gradient." A pause. "The ships will not clear the gradient. The physics will not allow it, and we will not help them. Your crews will." Another pause. "You have 90 minutes. I suggest you begin." The channel closed. Mixo sat in his chair. The amber indicators on the outer ring pulsed on the display in front of him. The compensation arrays on the 40 contacts held steady at 40%. He looked at the empty propulsion readout. He looked at the mass shear levels in the inner gradient, still climbing. He looked at the escape pod manifest for the Vanguard, 612 pods, enough for every crew member aboard. He thought about Warden Anya Corvo setting an iron weight on a podium and walking out of a room without a single word of argument. He thought about the automated message that had been waiting before she left the building. He thought about the entry route filed to the infrastructure division 4 days ago. She had not been preparing a response to the decree. She had been preparing this, all of it, before she left the sanctum, before the vote was even announced. He reached for his fleet admiral's channel. His hand, he noticed, was steady. "All crews," Mixo said. "All vessels, begin pod evacuation. Outer ring first." The fleet admiral acknowledged. The evacuation signal went out across the formation in the standard Aurelian emergency tone. 3 descending pulses, the sound every crew member trained to recognize and trained to move on without waiting for a second signal. Mixos watched the pod release indicators light up across the formation display. Outer ring first, as ordered. The indicators came on in clusters as each vessel's crew moved through their evacuation protocols, practiced, sequential, the kind of movement that happens when a crew has drilled a procedure enough times that the body does it while the mind is still processing. He watched the first pods clear their housings and drift outward, away from the formation, into the zone between the fleet and the 40 contacts. The contact's gravity compensation arrays responded immediately, localized fields extending outward from each contact, one field per pod, precisely enough coverage to carry each pod through the gradient to the outer zone where the shear dropped to survivable levels. 12 minutes per pod. The contacts had said so. 12 minutes of coverage, then the field retracted and extended to the next one. It was not generous, it was exact. The difference between the two was something Mixos was only now learning to read. His aide appeared at his shoulder. "Sir, your pod." "When the bridge crew has cleared." "Sir, the protocol requires." "When the bridge crew has cleared," Mixos said again, and his aide stopped speaking. He watched the display. The outer ring vessels were emptying steadily. The 40 contacts held their positions without deviation, the compensation arrays working pod by pod, the coverage never extending further than the calculation required. On the formation display, each vessel's crew manifest count ticked downward as pods cleared. 200, 150, 100, 50, 0. When a vessel reached 0, its indicator went dark. The inner gradient mass shear readings kept climbing. The Vanguard's bridge crew cleared in 11 minutes. Mixos was the last one. His aide had stopped arguing and simply waited by the pod bay entrance, and Mixos walked across the bridge he had occupied for 7 years and did not look at it the way you look at something you are leaving. He looked at the main display one more time. The formation, the contacts, the mass shear readings, the pod indicators still ticking across the outer and mid-formation. He sat down in the pod harness and let his aide seal the housing. In the moment before the pod ejected, in the brief mechanical pause between the housing seal and the release, he straightened the collar of his ceremonial robes. An old habit. Something he did before addressing the sanctum, before formal proceedings, before any moment that required him to appear exactly as he was supposed to appear. He did not know he was doing it until his hands were already done. The pod released. The gradient caught the pod, and the compensation field caught the pod at the same moment. A smooth, counter-pressured transit outward, the kind of ride that should have been rough and was instead careful. Someone had done the math on his pod specifically. He did not know if that was a deliberate choice or simply the consequence of a system that treated every pod the same. He suspected it was deliberate. The pod's viewport was small, a narrow band of transparency at eye level, angled forward. Through it, as the pod cleared the mid-formation and moved toward the outer zone, he could see the fleet. What he saw, he would describe later, in the deposition, in the report, in the account entered into the Concorde's permanent record, with a precision that surprised the officers taking his testimony, because it was the precision of someone who had watched something and been unable to look away. The dreadnoughts did not explode. That was the first thing. He had expected an explosion, had braced for it, had positioned himself in the harness for the shockwave. There was no shockwave. There was no fire, no rupture, no visible breach. What happened was quieter and took longer and was worse. The outer hulls, the massive, armored, billion-credit outer hulls of the Aurelian Concorde's finest warships, began to compress. Not crack, not shatter, compress. The mass shear worked on them the way a hand works on a piece of clay, evenly and from all sides, and the hulls that had been built to withstand weapons fire and energy discharge, and the hard vacuum of deep space had not been built to withstand this, because nothing was built to withstand this, because this was not a weapon. It was just gravity. It was just the shroud, doing what the shroud had always done, now that the things holding it back were gone. The dreadnoughts groaned. He could not hear it. The pod was sealed. The vacuum carried no sound, but the hull stress monitors in the pod's small dashboard were picking up the vibration through the gradient itself, and the sound those monitors translated the vibration into was a low, continuous moan, like metal remembering what pressure felt like. They folded inward, one by one, and then in groups. The great ships folded, not dramatically, not with the sudden violence of combat, but with a slow, inexorable compression that turned each vessel's angles into curves and each curve into a sphere. Dense, silent. The shroud took them and pressed them into shapes that had no name in any shipwright's manual, because no shipwright had designed for this failure mode. They sank. Not down, there was no down, but inward, into the gradient, toward the shroud's core mass, which did not distinguish between mineral deposits and warships and had never been asked to. Mixos watched. Gone, all of them, every hull. He watched the last dreadnought, the Vanguard, his ship, the one he had stood on 11 minutes ago, complete its compression and become a sphere and begin its descent. It took 4 minutes from the first visible deformation to the final shape. 4 minutes for a vessel that had taken 7 years to build. The compensation fields retracted from each sphere as it passed the point of no return. The 40 contacts had not moved. They had held their positions through the entire evacuation, the entire compression, the entire descent, and they held them still. 40 angular, matte-surfaced vessels sitting at the edge of the inner gradient, watching. Or not watching, that was a human word. They were simply there, which was something else entirely. Mike Sose's pod cleared the outer zone and entered the broad, cold space where the surviving Aurelian crews were collecting, thousands of pods, adrift, lit from below by the slow luminescence of the shroud. The compensation fields had delivered each one intact. Every crew member from every vessel was accounted for in the pod manifest system. Not one crew had been lost in the evacuation. The ships were gone. The crews were alive. He sat in the harness in his ceremonial robes and looked at the viewport. A refugee blanket was folded on the seat beside him, standard pod equipment, always there, never used by anyone who expected to use it. He unfolded it and put it around his shoulders, because the pod's thermal regulation was running on backup power and the cold was real. He thought about the entry route filed 4 days ago. He thought about an iron weight placed on a podium and the sound it made. He thought about a woman who had set an automated reply before she left a building, and what that meant about when she had stopped expecting the conversation to continue. 3 days later, what remained of the Aurelian Concord's administrative council gathered in the gilded sanctum. Not 80 species, 41. The rest had requested remote attendance or had not responded to the summons at all. The sanctum, built to hold thousands, held several hundred, and its acoustics, designed to make a whisper carry, now made the silence between speakers audible. Warden Anya Corvo stood at the central floor. She had not changed her jacket. The pale mineral dust from the outer sectors was still on it, or dust like it, the kind of particulate that settled on everything near the gravity shears and did not fully brush out. She set the iron core weight on the central podium. It landed with the same low, solid sound as before. It was heavier than it had been. Not physically, the weight was the same, but the surface was different. In the 3 days since the fleet had gone into the shroud, someone had worked the rusted iron face of the weight with a fine tool, cutting marks into it in rows, each mark smaller than a fingernail. 8,300 marks. One for each prospector who had died in the inner gradient when the anchors failed and the Concorde's relocation teams had not come. You could not read them from a distance. You had to be close. You had to be looking. Corvo rested her hand on the weight and looked at the assembled council. The Shroud Nebula is a closed zone, she said. Any hull crossing the boundary will be subject to local physics. We will not be installing new anchors. We will not be maintaining safe transit corridors. We will not be accepting administrative claims, survey rights, or diplomatic overtures regarding the zone or its contents. She paused. What is in the shroud belongs to the shroud. A representative from one of the mid-tier Concorde species, A small, still figure in the lower tiers raised a formal query marker. And the prospectors, those who are named, Corvo said, into the record, their designations, their rig numbers, their last logged positions. The record is open. Any species that wishes to add to it may do so. The representative lowered the query marker. Corvo tapped her thumb against her index finger. Once, twice, 3 times. She did not speak again for a long moment. The sanctum's acoustics carried the silence the way they had been built to carry voices, evenly, everywhere, so that everyone in the room felt it at the same volume. Then the shroud does not negotiate, neither do we. She picked up the iron weight. She did not file a formal closing statement. She did not wait for a motion to adjourn. She walked to the record pillar at the edge of the central floor and set the weight at its base, not on the pillar, not attached to anything, just resting there on the floor of the sanctum where anyone who came to the pillar would have to step around it or acknowledge it. Then she walked out. In a recovery station on the outer edge of the sector, Mike Sows sat in a standard-issue chair in a standard-issue room and read the transcript of Corvo's address on a borrowed terminal. He read it twice. He looked at the section about the record, the names, the rig numbers, the last logged positions, and he thought about the deposition he had given and the account he had filed and how those documents would sit in the same archive now, beside each other in the Concord's permanent record, for as long as the record was kept. He thought about the auto-reply she had set before she left the building. He thought about the iron weight on the podium, 11 days before the vote, and then again on the podium after the fleet was gone, and what it meant that the same object had been in both rooms. He thought about the marks on it, 8,300 marks, cut by hand, too small to read from a distance. You had to be close, you had to be looking. He closed the terminal. He folded his hands on the table. Outside the recovery station's single window, the outer sector was dark and unmarked. No beacons, no navigational markers, no lit corridors threading through the high-mass zones. Just space and the distant cold glow of the shroud, which was now closed, which had always been exactly what it was, which had never needed the Concorde's permission to be what it was. The floor gave out. The core didn't bounce.